Dakota Territory, late autumn 1887. The air already held the sharp, crystalline promise of a brutal winter. Men worked with a hurried desperation, chinking logs with mud and moss, banking their foundations with sod, and splitting the last of the season's wood. Every cabin looked the same, a squat box of rough-hewn logs with a massive stone fireplace and chimney dominating one wall, all except one. Carl Nilsson's cabin was the settlement's newest and its strangest. From the outside, it looked normal enough, but inside, where a great hearth should have stood, Nilsson was building something else entirely. A monstrous rectangular mass of fieldstone, clay, and river sand that rose from the floor nearly to the ceiling, occupying the very heart of the small room. It had no visible firebox, no grand opening to cheer a cold night. It was just a solid, silent block of masonry. He worked alone, his movements deliberate and unhurried. His neighbors would stop by, lean against the doorframe, and watch. They saw a man building a tomb in the center of his own home. They saw a fool, an outsider who didn't understand the realities of a Dakota winter, cementing his family's doom one stone at a time. They called it Nilsson's Folly. What did this quiet Swedish immigrant, a man with calloused farmer's hands and no reputation as a builder, understand about heat that every seasoned pioneer on that frozen prairie had missed? What secret was he sealing away inside that colossal stone box? The answer would not be found in tradition or common sense. It would be found in the unforgiving physics of fire itself. Hit that subscribe button and stay with me, because the story of this simple farmer's radical idea is a masterclass in forgotten wisdom. To understand the madness of Carl Nilsson's method, you must first understand the brutal reality he and his neighbors faced. The Great Plains were not a gentle land. Winter arrived not as a season, but as an invading army. It came with a wind that had no trees to slow it, a wind that scoured the landscape and drove ice crystals through the smallest cracks in a cabin's walls. Temperatures didn't just drop. They plummeted into a realm where metal became brittle and a man's exposed skin would freeze solid in minutes. 40 below zero was not an anomaly, it was an expectation. For the settlers in their small, scattered cabins, winter was a 6-month siege. The enemy was the cold, and the only weapon they had was fire. Their weapon, however, was deeply flawed. The standard design, brought west from the forested hills of Ohio and Pennsylvania, was the great stone fireplace. It was a symbol of hearth and home, a roaring, cheerful centerpiece that consumed enormous logs and threw off a visible, tangible heat. A man could stand before it, turning like a pig on a spit, and feel the warmth bake into his front while his back remained chilled. But the settlers confused the sensation of heat with the efficiency of heating. They mistook the bright, dancing flames for victory. It was an illusion. The physics of their situation were grim. An open fireplace is, in essence, a giant, inefficient pump. It draws vast quantities of air from the room to feed its hungry flames. This creates a powerful draft. For every cubic foot of heated air that rushed up the chimney, a cubic foot of frigid, dense outside air was pulled in through every crack and gap in the cabin's construction. The fire warmed the air directly in front of it, only to have that warmth immediately stolen and replaced by a new wave of cold. The family huddled close to the flames, their world reduced to a small hemisphere of comfort in a room that was otherwise barely above freezing. The evidence of this failure was everywhere. A thick rime of frost grew on the inside of the walls, sometimes inches thick. Ink froze solid in its wells. A bucket of water left 10 feet from the fire would be skimmed with ice by morning. The settlers were living in a constant, bone-deep chill, punctuated by moments of being scorched on one side. The cost was measured in wood, an astronomical amount of wood. A family might burn through an entire cord, a stack 8 feet long, 4 feet wide, and 4 feet high, in just a few weeks of deep winter. This meant that a man's primary winter labor was a relentless, exhausting cycle of felling, hauling, bucking, splitting, and stacking wood, just to feed the insatiable appetite of the very thing meant to give him rest. He was burning his life force to stay alive. Carl Nilsson had watched all of this during his first mercifully mild winter in the territory. He saw men twice his size, men who had been on the prairie for a decade, perpetually exhausted and anxious about their wood piles. He saw their wives wrapping children in every available blanket, their breath crystallizing in the air inside their own homes. He saw the waste, the sheer, staggering waste. Nilsson was not an engineer or a physicist. He was a farmer from the rocky, forested province of Småland in southern Sweden. But in his homeland, the winters were also long and dark, and the forests were not endless. For centuries, his people had developed a different relationship with fire. They had been forced by scarcity to become masters of efficiency. They did not build fires to be looked at. They built fires to capture every last calorie of heat. He remembered the heart of his grandfather's house. It was not a gaping fireplace, but a tall tiled stove called a kakelugn. It was a beautiful ceramic column that stood quietly in the main room. His grandfather would build a small, brief, but furiously hot fire in it, once in the morning and once in the evening. For the rest of the day and all through the night, the tall stove would radiate a gentle, pervasive warmth that filled the entire house. There were no drafts, no cold spots. Children could play on the floor in their stocking feet. He had no glazed tiles here, and no memory of the exact plans. But he remembered the principle. He understood that the goal was not to heat the air in the room, which was fleeting and easily lost. The goal was to heat the mass of the house itself. The goal was to create a heat battery. So, as autumn deepened, Carl Nilsson began to build. He ignored the advice, the warnings, and the eventual mockery of his neighbors. He was building his battery. He started with a foundation of flat, heavy stones, dug slightly into the hard-packed dirt floor of his cabin. Upon this, he began to construct not a fireplace, but an engine designed for a single purpose, to extract and store thermal energy. He used the stones he and his wife Anya had cleared from their small plot of land. He bound them with a mortar made from clay dug at the riverbank, mixed with sand and dried grass. His neighbors watched, perplexed. The structure had no opening at the bottom. The first major components he built were 2 vertical channels, side by side, deep inside the growing mass of stone. One was shorter, the other taller. He connected them at the bottom, forming a distinct J shape. This was the firebox. It was utterly alien to anyone who had ever built a fire. Jedediah Thorne came to visit one afternoon. Thorne was the closest thing the settlement had to an authority. He was a master carpenter from New Hampshire who had built his first cabin before Carl Nilsson was even born. He was a practical, respected man whose work was solid and whose advice was sought. He stood, arms crossed, watching Nilsson carefully place a stone. "Carl," Thorne said, his voice not unkind, I've built more than 50 fireplaces from here to the Black Hills. I know what works." Nielsen nodded, not stopping his work. "Yes, Mr. Thorne." "That firebox, it's upside down. The smoke has to go down before it can go up. It'll never draw. The moment you light a fire in there, this whole cabin will fill with smoke. You'll choke your wife and children in their sleep." It was a sound, logical objection. Smoke rises. Everyone knew that. To force it down seemed like defying gravity. "The fire will be very hot," Carl replied simply, fitting another stone into place. "A hot fire pushes." Thorne shook his head, a look of genuine concern on his face. He pointed to the immense bulk of the structure. "And all this stone, son, it's inside your walls. It's a heat sink. It will suck every bit of warmth out of your fire. You'll burn a cord of wood just trying to warm the rock. By the time that thing starts putting out any heat, your family will have frozen to death." Again, the logic was impeccable, based on conventional experience. A massive stone fireplace on an outside wall was already slow to heat. Putting an even larger mass in the center of the room seemed like madness. "The stone is where the heat will live," Carl said, wiping clay from his hands. It was the best explanation he could offer. Thorne left that day convinced the Swede was a well-meaning but dangerously ignorant fool. The story of his warnings spread through the settlement. The mockery grew louder. At the small trading post, men would laugh. "Heard Nielsen's building a smokehouse," one would say, "with his family still in it." The name stuck. Nielsen's Folly. Carl and Anya heard the whispers. They saw the pitying looks, but they continued their work. Anya mixed the clay mortar, her hands raw and chapped. Carl lifted the heavy stones, his back aching. They were building against the coming cold and against the crushing weight of community consensus. As the stone mass grew higher, Carl began to build the second crucial part of his system, the flue. But it was not a straight, vertical chimney. He constructed a long serpentine channel that snaked back and forth through the upper two-thirds of the masonry structure. He created a maze for the hot gases. The path was over 20 feet long, but it was all contained within the stone block that stood in the middle of his one-room cabin. Only at the very top did a small, modest stovepipe emerge to pass through the roof. This was the most baffling part to the onlookers. A long flue path was known to cool smoke, reducing the draw and causing creosote to build up, which led to chimney fires. Thorne's objection echoed in the minds of everyone who saw it. A cool flue wouldn't draw. It was a fire trap and a smoke-filled disaster waiting to happen. Finally, after weeks of labor, it was finished. The structure was plastered with a final smooth layer of clay. It stood 6 feet high, 3 feet wide, and nearly 8 feet long. At one end was a small, heavy iron door for loading wood into the vertical channel. At the other end, near the floor, was another small iron door for cleaning out ash. It was featureless, silent, and imposing. It dominated the small cabin. Now the system could be understood. It was a lung built of stone. When Carl lit a fire, the process was entirely different from the lazy orange flames of a fireplace. He used small, dry wood, mostly branches and split logs, no thicker than a man's wrist. He dropped them down the taller channel of the J firebox. The fire ignited with a roar. Because the channel was narrow and deep, the air was drawn down through the fuel at a tremendous speed. This created a miniature forge, a fire burning at over 1,000 degrees Celsius. At this temperature, combustion was almost perfectly complete. The fire burned not just the wood, but the smoke and gases themselves. This was the secondary combustion, the clean, violent burn that produced almost no smoke and no creosote. This intensely hot jet of gas was then forced down, under a baffle, and into the long, winding flue channels. Here the second principle took over, heat exchange. As the superheated gases crawled through the 20-foot maze, they were in constant contact with the cooler stone. The stone acted like a sponge, absorbing the thermal energy. The gases gave up their heat, degree by degree, as they moved through the system. By the time the exhaust finally reached the stovepipe to exit the roof, it was so cool that a man could comfortably hold his hand over the opening. Almost 95% of the heat generated by the fire had been captured and stored in the 2-ton mass of stone and clay. The fire itself lasted only about an hour. It was a brief, violent, and incredibly efficient event. When the flames died down, Carl would close the airtight iron doors, sealing the system. The heat was now trapped inside the masonry battery. Then, the third principle began its silent work: thermal mass and radiant heat. The massive, warm structure began to slowly, gently radiate its stored energy into the room. It wasn't a blast of hot air. It was a pervasive, gentle warmth, like the feeling of standing in the sun on a spring day. It warmed the floors, the walls, the furniture, and the people. The entire cabin became a stable, comfortable environment. Carl would burn one of these small, hot fires in the morning and another before bed. That was all. A wheelbarrow's worth of small branches would keep his family comfortable for 24 hours. But his neighbors saw none of this internal magic. They only saw a man who lit a fire for an hour and then let it go out. They saw a tiny wisp of white steam from his chimney, not the reassuring column of thick, gray smoke that poured from their own. They saw a fool, and they waited for the cold to teach him his lesson. December came, and the cold deepened. January arrived with a vengeance. The temperature hovered at 20 below for 2 straight weeks. The wind was a constant, physical presence. The settlers' lives narrowed to the space around their roaring fires. The sound of axes on wood was incessant. Woodpiles dwindled at an alarming rate. Then, on January 12, 1888, the sky turned a strange, ominous yellow-gray. The temperature, which had been a relatively mild 15 degrees Fahrenheit at dawn, began to drop with supernatural speed. By noon, it was below zero. By sunset, it was -20. The wind rose to a howling gale, picking up the loose surface snow and turning the air into a blinding, suffocating torrent of white. This was not a storm. This was a continental event. A polar vortex had descended, a wave of Arctic air that would be remembered for a century as the schoolhouse blizzard, the great white hurricane of the plains. For the settlers, the world simply ended. Visibility dropped to zero. The air itself was so cold it hurt to breathe. The wind tore at their cabins, forcing icy dust through every imperfection. Their fireplaces, which had been struggling to keep the cold at bay, now failed catastrophically. The harder the wind blew outside, the more air the chimneys sucked from the rooms. The fires roared, consuming wood at a terrifying pace, but the heat was stolen as fast as it was produced. Families abandoned all pretense of normal life. They dragged their mattresses and blankets as close to the fire as they dared, wrapping themselves together for warmth, and fed the flames constantly. In his sturdy, well-built cabin, Jedediah Thorne was fighting a losing battle. He had one of the largest fireplaces in the settlement, a monument of stone he had built with his own hands. It was now his enemy. He was burning seasoned oak logs that should have lasted for hours, and they were turning to ash in minutes. The wind howled down his chimney, driving puffs of smoke back into the room. A layer of ice was forming on the wall opposite the hearth. His wife, Martha, was huddled with their two sons, their faces pale and frightened in the flickering firelight. Thorn was a man of immense competence and pride, but for the first time in his life he felt the cold touch of true, mortal fear. He looked at his woodpile inside the cabin, a stack that should have lasted 3 days. He knew, with a sinking certainty, that it would not last the night. He found himself thinking of Carl Nilsson. He pictured the quiet Swede and his family, huddled inside their cabin around that inert block of stone. He imagined their fire, choked with smoke, having gone out hours ago. He felt a pang of guilt. Had he just mocked the man when he should have intervened? Had his pride and the whole community's stubbornness allowed a family to freeze? The thought became an obsession. The Nilssons were new. They didn't have the deep reserves of wood the other families did. Their cabin was on the western edge of the settlement, the most exposed to the wind. By now, they must be in terrible trouble. Maybe they were already gone. As the night wore on and the temperature dropped to an unthinkable 40 below, Thorn made a decision. He could not live with himself if he did nothing. He had to check on them. Martha pleaded with him not to go. To step outside was suicide. But his guilt was a stronger force than the wind. He wrapped himself in every layer of wool and canvas he owned, pulling a heavy fur cap down over his ears and tying a scarf over his mouth and nose. He took a lantern, though he knew it would be useless in the blizzard, and a coil of rope. He tied one end to his door latch. He would play out the rope to the Nilssons' cabin, a lifeline in the white chaos. If he let go, he would be lost forever. The moment he opened the door, the storm hit him like a physical blow. The air was a maelstrom of ice and wind that stole his breath. He could not see his own feet. He stumbled forward, leaning into the gale, paying out the rope hand over frozen hand. The 200 yards to Nilsson's cabin felt like miles. The wind screamed in his ears, a sound of pure elemental fury. He was guided only by the rope and a vague sense of direction. He fell twice, the cold seeping into his bones, and nearly gave up. What if they were already dead? What could he possibly do? But he pushed on, driven by the image of Nilsson's small children. Finally, his outstretched hand hit something solid, the log wall of the cabin. He fumbled his way along it, searching for the door, his body shaking uncontrollably from cold and exertion. He found the latch and pounded on the thick wood with his gloved fist. He waited. No answer. He pounded again, shouting Carl's name, his voice swallowed by the storm. A terrible dread filled him. He was too late. He put his shoulder to the door, ready to break it down, and then he heard the sound of the bar being lifted from inside. The door swung inward. It was not a wave of frigid air that greeted him. It was a solid, palpable wall of warmth. It washed over him, so profound and unexpected that he staggered back. It was not the scorching, dry heat of a roaring fire. It was a gentle, humid, and utterly pervasive warmth. He stumbled inside, pulling the door shut against the raging storm, and stood there, blinking, utterly disoriented. The scene before him was impossible. It was a hallucination. The cabin was bathed in the soft, steady light of 2 oil lamps. There was no fire visible. The great stone structure in the center of the room was dark and silent. Yet the air was warmer than his own cabin had been at noon. Anya Nilsson was at a small table, kneading dough, her sleeves rolled up to her elbows. Steam rose from a kettle on a small iron cooktop set into the top of the stone monolith. The two children, Eric and Sophia, were on the floor playing with carved wooden toys. They were in their bare feet, on the floor, in the middle of the worst blizzard in living memory. Carl Nilsson stood before him, a look of concern on his face. He was wearing a simple wool shirt, unbuttoned at the collar. There was no frost on the walls. There was no desperate huddling. There was only a scene of impossible, tranquil domesticity. Thorn was speechless. He slowly unwrapped the scarf from his face. It was frozen stiff. His beard was a solid mass of ice. He could feel the blood returning to his cheeks in a painful prickle. "Mr. Thorn," Carl said, his voice calm, "are you all right? You should not be out in this." Thorn could only stare. He was an expert. He knew how a house should feel at 40 below. It should feel like a tomb. This felt like summer. His eyes went to the stone structure, the object of his ridicule. Nilsson's folly. He walked toward it, his legs unsteady, and placed a bare hand on its smooth clay side. It was warm, not hot, not burning, but deeply, profoundly warm, a steady, radiant heat that felt alive. He ran his hand over its surface. It was warm everywhere, the top, the sides, the front, the back. He looked around the cabin again, trying to reconcile what he was seeing with everything he knew to be true. "The fire? Where is the fire?" Thorn asked, his voice hoarse. "It is out," Carl said. "I lit the evening fire at 6 o'clock. It burned for an hour." Thorn looked at the clock on the wall. It was nearly 10. The fire had been out for 3 hours. The storm was at its absolute peak, and this cabin was 70 degrees. He felt a dizzying sense of vertigo, as if the fundamental laws of the universe had been overturned. His builder's mind took over, searching for an explanation. He looked at the small pile of wood next to the structure. It was pathetic. It was a small stack of branches and split limbs, barely enough to keep his own fire going for 2 hours. "How much wood have you burned today?" Thorn demanded. Carl shrugged. "About that much," he said, gesturing to a second, identical pile on the other side. "One pile for the morning fire, one for the evening?" Thorn did the math in his head. The calculation was so staggering it made him nauseous. Nilsson was keeping his family in a state of perfect comfort through the worst storm in history, using less than 10% of the wood Thorn was burning just to stay alive. 10%. The numbers were undeniable. They were a judgment. He looked at Nilsson. The quiet Swede was not gloating. There was no hint of "I told you so" in his eyes. There was only a simple, honest concern. Jedediah Thorn, the most respected builder in the territory, a man whose word was law on matters of construction, felt a lifetime of certainty crumble to dust. He had not just been wrong, he had been dangerously, arrogantly, spectacularly wrong. His expertise had been revealed as ignorance. His wisdom was folly. It was Nilsson who was the wise one. He sank onto a nearby bench, the warmth of the room seeping into his frozen core, and put his head in his hands. "I was wrong," he said, the words heavy and tasting of ash. "I came here expecting to find you dead. My own family is freezing to death right now, in a house I built, a house I was proud of." He looked up at Carl, his eyes filled with a desperate, burning humility. "I was wrong. This works. Will you teach me?" The storm raged for another 36 hours, but inside the Nielsen cabin, life went on. Thorne stayed, unable to face the journey back. He watched in awe as Carl lit the morning fire. He saw the brief, intense roar, the lack of smoke, and then the silence as the stone lung began its slow, steady exhalation of heat. He ate the fresh bread Anya pulled from a small oven built into the side of the heater. He saw a level of comfort and security he had never believed possible. When the blizzard finally broke, the world was transformed. It was a landscape of colossal snowdrifts under a piercingly blue sky. The cold was still savage. Word spread of the devastation. Lives had been lost. Livestock had frozen in the fields. Several families had survived only by burning their furniture. Thorne returned to his cabin to find a scene of wreckage. The fire had eventually gone out. The interior was a chaos of ice and frozen belongings. It took him and his family a full day to make it habitable again. The next week, a small procession of men made their way to Carl Nielsen's cabin. They were led by Jedediah Thorne. They were the settlement's leaders, the most experienced builders and farmers. They came not to mock, but to learn. They stood in the impossible warmth of Nielsen's home, their hats in their hands, and listened. Carl, with Thorne translating his sometimes halting English, explained the principles. He didn't use terms like thermal mass or secondary combustion. He spoke in simple, practical language. The fire must burn hot and fast, like the sun, all of it, the smoke too. Then you must give the heat a place to stay. You trap it in the stone. The stone will hold it for you and give it back slowly. You do not heat the air. You heat the house. That spring, a new kind of construction began. Thorne, now Nielsen's most fervent disciple, supervised the retrofitting of his own cabin. He tore out his massive, wasteful fireplace and, with Carl's guidance, built a masonry heater in its place. Nielsen's folly was no longer a term of mockery. It became a term of respect. Soon, people were just calling it the Nielsen heater. The next winter, the difference was night and day. Cabins that had once been drafty caves of misery were now warm and comfortable. The incessant, back-breaking labor of cutting wood was reduced by 80, sometimes 90%. The health of the community improved. Children no longer suffered from constant respiratory ailments caused by smoke and cold. Carl Nielsen never sought fame or payment. He shared his knowledge freely, helping any who asked. He remained a quiet farmer. His innovation was not a product he sold, but an idea he gave away. His reward was seeing his neighbors safe and warm, seeing their children thrive. The true impact wasn't measured in degrees on a thermometer or in cords of wood saved. It was measured in human dignity. It was the ability for a family to sit down for a meal in the evening without shivering. It was a mother being able to put her child to sleep, knowing they would be warm until morning. It was the end of the winter siege and the beginning of a life where the cold was a manageable fact, not an ever-present threat of death. The story of Carl Nielsen and his foolish stone box is a powerful reminder that sometimes the most revolutionary ideas are not new at all, but are simply old wisdom, forgotten by a world in a hurry. It shows that established expertise can sometimes be the biggest obstacle to real progress, and that true innovation often comes from the quiet outsider who sees the problem with fresh eyes. The principles of the Nielsen heater, of clean combustion, thermal mass, and efficient heat exchange are not historical relics. They are the very foundation of modern high-efficiency heating systems, from masonry heaters still built today to advanced biomass boilers. The quiet Swedish farmer was not just building a stove. He was demonstrating a timeless principle of living smarter, not harder. If this story of forgotten wisdom resonated with you, hit that like button to help spread it, and subscribe to this channel for more stories of the practical ingenuity that built our world. What's the coldest winter you've ever had to endure? Let me know in the comments below. This narrative is a fictionalized account created for educational and entertainment purposes. While the engineering principles of masonry heaters, thermal mass, and secondary combustion are real and historically accurate, the characters, specific events, and location are composite creations. This content is intended to illustrate historical concepts and should not be taken as professional engineering or construction advice. Always consult with qualified professionals for any building project.